Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the study of antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, and today we are joined by a very special guest that's going to take us into a fascinating topic. And so, without further ado, Matthias van Hanen, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks very much, Nick.
He is going to be taking us into an obscure but fascinating topic, and that is the subject of slavery in the Viking world. And so without further ado, we're going to jump into this. And so for our audience today, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So I'm Matthias van Hanen. I am an undergraduate student at the University of Cambridge, Gonville and Caius College. And my subject is Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic. Personally, within the department, I'm kind of what is referred to as a Germanicist. So my focus is on the pre-1066 English world, as well as the Scandinavian world. And study the history and languages of that era. And the reason why I'm talking to you is because I did my undergraduate dissertation about slavery in the Viking world.
When you hear the term Viking, based on your research, your expertise, and even your imagination, what do you think of?
I can't help being influenced by stuff like HBO's Vikings. And I'm a very visual kind of person. So I do draw a lot of stuff from pop culture, and it's good that there's a lot more media out there these days, which is quite historically accurate as well. When I think about the term Viking, my emphasis is always on Scandinavians abroad. Though, of course, you did have Vikings raiding within Scandinavia, but largely, as the term is a bit of a external one, when you hear about Vikings, you tend to think about Scandinavians going to France, to Germany, to Britain, and that tends to be it. So I'm thinking raiding parties, and despite the fact that in recent years, the study has focused more and more on the, trader side of Scandinavians operating outside Scandinavia. That doesn't change the fact that Vikings, even in my imagination, they're still more violent and more aggressive, shall we say.
When you hear the term slave, in the context of Northern European and let's just say Viking societies, what typically comes to your mind?
There already we have to make a pretty big distinction in that there's Northern Europe in general, then you've got the Scandinavian societies, and then you've got those societies which I would classify as Viking. And those specifically Viking societies aren't necessarily in Scandinavia, and I'll get to that. But generally speaking, like slavery has been a part of our conception of Northern Europe, shall we say, the Germanic world, which is what we have the most sources on, going back to like Roman sources. They do tend to describe Germanic peoples taking slaves, particularly taking prisoners of war and turning them into slaves. So it's something that's been there as long as we have sources. But particularly when we're looking at Northern Europe, we tend to be thinking about areas where you don't have large-scale land holding, you don't have these like Roman villas that of Southern Europe. And so slavery isn't seen as something or the way we understand slavery in Northern Europe and in the Scandinavian world, it's not something that's economically very viable. So there are only a handful of sources and areas where it really seems like slavery became an important economic factor in the local areas. And rather, it's something that we see in, for example, graves. We might find double graves where you have one body which is clearly clad in more prestigious outfits, has more jewelry and so forth. And then you have another one which might still be bound at the arms and wrists, clearly might be signs that they've just been killed before being placed in the grave. And we have these indications that slavery might have been more of a prestige thing, maybe something more that a household might have one slave, and even then it would be a fairly wealthy household. But then when we look to the Viking world, that is to say the areas of Britain, France, Iceland, where Scandinavians would settle, slavery is something which seems to be there more from the start. And particularly in these Viking societies, I would say that the nature of the slavery is very focused around, I would say, women, in the sense that there would be many more concubines. A lot of the studies into genetics are indicating that, for example, the early population of Iceland, there was a large, potentially even over half of the female population initially settling Iceland would have been of Celtic background, which we might interpret as indicating that they were slaves or brought there against their will, particularly considering as when we look at many of the Icelandic later written sources, there aren't that many named persons of Celtic extraction, which would seem to indicate that these are people of a lower social class already. So the way I think about slavery in the Viking world, the more a Viking that particular social structure is, the likelier it is that slavery played a big role in it.
When it comes to the Vikings and their world, do we know what they actually called their slaves?
Yes, we have a couple terms that we know. Most of these, of course, come from later sources, though, of course, we have some runic inscriptions which mention slaves. But most of them do come from later literary sources. But terms such as thrall, so thrall, that's already a very clear equivalent in English. That term had a female equivalent, ambalt. And so in terms of how the sources seem to depict and use terms for slaves, thrall and ambalt were kind of the equivalent. So you have the male slave and the female slave. Then you have some interesting terminology, I would say. You've got terms like thý and anáðigur, which are less specific, I would say. So, for example, with anáðigur, it's a term which gives us an idea of the, I guess, etymology for some of the terms that Scandinavians would have used for their slaves. So it comes from the same root as the word for oppressed. And so that is a very useful term for slaves because it helps us understand what defined slaves in Scandinavian society to the people back in the Viking Age. You've got terms like sven and man or huskarl, which could be free, but could also be unfree. And this is where it gets very interesting because there are terms which are indicating a sense of a bondage and, to an extent, unfreeness, but whether that's the same as slavishness. This is something that Ruth Mazo Karas has written a lot about. I recommend that you guys go check out her work. But these are terms that indicate a degree of unfreeness, but it's not necessarily what we would call slavery these days. For example, you've got the term bruti, which is kind of ambiguous. It generally seems to mean like a bailiff. So somebody who is unfree, but responsible for other slaves. So you've got a rune stone raised by a person referred to as bruti. So, and the king's bruti, no less. So an unfree person, but also directly subservient to a king, somebody with a lot of power. So some of these terms don't give us great indications towards the degree of unfreeness, but there was clearly a variety of, I guess, groups within Scandinavian society which were unfree, but we have to be kind of cautious with considering them slaves because in our modern society, the word slave is very heavily influenced by the, I would say, 18th, up until 19th century conception of slavery, particularly in the New World. And when we think about slavery in the Scandinavian world, we can't directly transfer that understanding, because what slavery meant in the Scandinavian world is something very different than what it meant in pre-Civil War USA. One of the most interesting, I would say, aspects of Scandinavian terms for slaves is that there don't seem to be any ethnically charged terms. So unlike, for example, in Old English, you've got the term Welsh, which is the equivalent of Welsh. So there's that link. Or with the Romans, Sklavus, from Slavs, you do not have this anywhere in Scandinavia. So there doesn't seem to be any sort of clear linguistic evidence for Scandinavians viewing particular groups and peoples around themselves as being, these are the people we are enslaving, these are the slavish people. We don't really have that, where in other parts of Europe, this was very clearly a thing, which I found very fascinating. But then looking further into what we know of named slaves, for example, you have many people with very Scandinavian names. You have some examples of Celtic names, but then it also gets interesting because those same Celtic names, for example, in Iceland, keep showing up throughout the years, but without evidence of them having recently come over from Ireland or Scotland. So those Celtic names were then adopted by the Icelanders. So you really get into a position where even the names don't necessarily provide solid evidence. But it is really fascinating as a difference with the rest of Europe that slavery wasn't necessarily tied to ethnicity in the Scandinavian world during the Viking Age.
You mentioned the possibility of a certain group maybe being slaves and maybe not. Could that translate into almost, I guess you could say, the equivalent of like a medieval serf? Like they're not necessarily slaves, but we know they can't really do everything that they want.
Yeah, I think that is, a useful reference point through which to think about it. Of course, the trouble is that we don't really have a good grasp on the legal responsibilities and, legal position of that's associated with these terms, as most of the Scandinavian legal texts in which some of these terms survive are from the 12th or 13th centuries, so already after the Viking Age. So we can kind of try to extrapolate back whether using a term like serf would be good, but when considering the Viking Age specifically, we can draw parallels, but I would still not use the term serf directly.
Let's talk Viking society, slaves, and their importance. How important were slaves to the Viking world in general?
This is really the meat and potatoes of the research that I was doing, and specifically thinking about slavery more than in the, ownership of slaves, and also in the trafficking and sale of slaves. Because for Viking society at large, and Scandinavian society more specifically, we have examples of slaves pretty much everywhere in Scandinavia, but there are only a couple regions where there was a clear economic benefit to be gained from owning lots of slaves. One of these regions is Skåne in southern Sweden, which used to be part of the Kingdom of Denmark, where there were some larger farms owned by some local magnates. On some of these farms in Skåne, archaeologists have found big deposits of Slavic-style pottery. And historians such as Mats Roslund have suggested that this would be evidence that on these particular farm sites, they would have had Slavic slaves. because the making of pottery probably wasn't a very prestigious job. This would have been something that a laborer does in addition to the rest of the tasks of the farm. And because Slavic style pottery isn't evenly distributed throughout Scandinavia, rather it's really clustered in these southern Swedish farms. Southern Sweden also a bit of a better area to farm during the Viking Age compared to for like more northern Sweden going up towards modern day Stockholm, because you had more lakes, you had denser forests breaking up the land. Southern Sweden, very flat, good land for farming. And so there are, and considering at the same time, you've got this political consolidation where a couple magnates controlled very large parts of Skåne, it's not unreasonable to think that in this particular case, slaves would have actually formed an important part of the economy, and that they would have been specifically Slavic slaves due to this archaeological evidence of the Slavic style pottery. Then, looking at, for example, Norway, we don't have this, because in Norway, farms were much smaller. You've got the fjords really breaking up land ownership, and you also had a lot less political consolidation during the Viking Age because, again, the fjords, the mountains, it's difficult terrain to consolidate in. Also why the Kingdom of Norway didn't emerge before the Kingdom of Denmark. And so in Norway, there is less evidence of slaves on farms. But then when you look at, for example, the Icelandic sagas that concern the initial settlement of Iceland. In all of those sagas, you've got also other sources like the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements. You have examples of slaves coming to Iceland from the beginning. And of course, some of these are more mythical stories, I would suggest, like there is the account of Náttfari, a name which translates to night traveler, a man who arrives in Iceland, I think among the first settlers. He comes there during the first wintering in Iceland. And so he has with him a man identified as a thrall and a woman identified as an ambát, so a male and a female slave. And so that... And it's in one of the very first chapters of Landnámabók, which makes it very interesting because is this sort of a passage with which to consolidate the various legends about the discovery of Iceland? Is it a passage with which to justify slavery in Iceland? There can be various interpretations, but really the source material says that slavery was there, but it's also very small scale. Then looking at thinking about the significance, I do think that concubines are a big part of the social significance of slavery in the Scandinavian world, particularly in the settlements. So in the case of Iceland, in the saga sources and the sort of histories, we could call them, you have examples of men, Scandinavian men, having Celtic concubines. So one sort of famous literary example is Melkorka, who is the mother of a sort of very prominent Gothi, mentioned in both the Landnámabók, so in a more historical source, as well as the Laxdæla saga, so the saga of the people of Salmon, of the Salmon Valley. And so she is the daughter of an Irish king in these sagas and in these sources. So you also tend to have this thing where named successors of Celts in Iceland, the Celtic people they are descended from tend to be royalty in these sources, which of course is also something interesting because then you have to wonder, so is this something that the people who are compiling these texts included to sort of make these families and lineages more prestigious, because these are also political texts. But evidently there was I would say, a preservation of oral traditions about these families and about these persons, which included kidnapped princesses, basically. But so looking at Iceland, the significance seems to be more in terms of, in the early settlement period, the sources tend to name men settling in Iceland. There is a discrepancy in the number of named women. And then looking at the genetic DNA evidence as well, it looks like there would have been a fairly large Celtic population among the first waves of settlers in Iceland. So in terms of just the initial founding of Iceland, slavery seems to have played a significant role. But then there's my favorite bit, which is sort of the economics and slave trading. When we look at Viking activity in the British Isles, you have a lot of cases of people being kidnapped, taken captive against ransoms. The sources mention ransoming much more frequently than outright enslavement. This is also true in the sort of Frankish sources. And it's very interesting to me how the sources tend to name the victims who have been taken captive, often also name the prices paid for their ransom. And these tend to be very prestigious characters. We're talking bishops, abbots and abbesses, in some cases aristocracy. And it does force one to wonder whether they were just recorded because they were such prestigious individuals, and that's why their ransoms are mentioned, and whether simply the nature of the sources, which are mostly concerned with elite matters, which are stuff like the Annals of Saint Bertin and the Annals of Fulda, which were maintained in monasteries. If part of it is because they're more concerned with ecclesiastical and noble matters, that is why they don't record things like this and this many slaves were taken. Some of the Irish sources and Irish annals do give us information on, in this year there was a slave raid by the folks identified as Vikings in this area. And so we do have more of that evidence from Irish sources. And we're talking, these are also Irish folks writing the sources, which is important. Because when we look at Eastern Europe, which we haven't been talking about yet, slavery seems to be a much bigger deal. And what was happening in Eastern Europe was you had people from Scandinavia. We tend to think people from Sweden going along the Eastern European river network to Central Asia, to the Islamic world, to trade captives for silver dirhams, which were very high quality silver coins. This is relevant because Scandinavia was sort of the Scandinavian economy was more interested in bullion. So the quantity of silver or gold in the coin, the weight, rather than what's printed on the coin, which is why Scandinavians would chop up their coins and then weigh it on scales rather than paying with the coin as we would do. And because the highest quality coins were found in the Caliphate, that's where you had Scandinavians going. And while going along these river networks, they would take captives of the Slavic, Baltic, and in these times as well, Finnic communities, and take them to be sold at slave markets in what is now Kazakhstan. And we have some cases of Scandinavian traders going all the way to Baghdad. And so this is attested to in both the writings of a Byzantine emperor who wrote De Administrando Imperio. So a bit of a guide on how to rule Byzantium. In that text, he writes about the practices of the Rus, as they came to be called, in taking tribute from the populations in the territories around that they've settled in, and also how they would take slaves to market. And then we have Arabic travelers, such as Ibn Fadlan, who encountered Scandinavian slave traders and wrote very extensively about some of their conduct with slaves. So some historians do view Ibn Fadlan's writing a little skeptically because he seems positively voyeuristic, and he was an Islamic scholar. So perhaps he might have embellished some of the stories to make the Scandinavians seem that much more awful and unsanitary and barbaric. But then we also have other Arabic traveler sources that mention Scandinavians as slave traders. However, them mentioning that they treated their slaves very well. So we have varying sources on how the Scandinavians treated their slaves, but we know that they were taking slaves to the Islamic world to sell. And estimates on how significant this was vary. So we've got Marek Jankowiak's estimate that in the 10th century alone, 30,000 to 60,000 people would have been sold by Scandinavians to the Islamic world in exchange for dirhams. Then you've got many people don't want to really estimate numbers just because it's a bit of rolling the dice and see how you decide to extrapolate from the sources. But then we've got the 9th century Arabic writer Al-Jahiz, who says that most of the white eunuchs in 9th century Baghdad were Slavs. So clearly, like, there was a buyer's market, like there was demand for slaves, and the Scandinavians who wanted that high quality silver were going east and selling slaves that they captured along the way. And I would definitely emphasize, in terms of the significance of slavery, it is the economic significance of taking hostages and ransoming them. And then to a lesser extent, it's the slave trade, but it is very sort of geographically specific. So you had slave trading in Ireland and you had ransoming. In Eastern Europe, all the sources seem to indicate that it was very focused on selling slaves to the Islamic world. And then when we look at Frankish or French sources and even English sources, there are fewer and fewer mentions of outright taking slaves. And a lot of these stories are focused around the Scandinavians trying to get ransoms. You've got the case of the martyrdom of an English bishop called Alfher in 1012, which was so supposedly the Scandinavians pelted him with bones because initially they had captured him in the hopes of getting a ransom for this bishop, and he just flat out refused them. That he was telling people that he will not be ransomed, and so the angry crowd pelted him with bones, and he died. Of course, this is something that is probably not historically accurate, in the sense that it sounds very much like the martyrdom of Saint Stephen, being shot with arrows. Here you've got Alfher being pelted with bones. Medieval writers and medieval hagiographers love to reference other saints and other martyrs in their stories and texts. So not necessarily historically accurate. However, the detail of the Scandinavians expecting to be able to ransom this bishop and not being able to, and that frustrating them, that is something which is far more believable. And so the significance of slavery, exactly, to sort of wrap up this rambling, in the way that I've been able to piece it together in my research, is that slavery was not economically significant in terms of slave owning outside a couple cases in areas with consolidated landholding and good farmland. It was much more socially significant for, I would say, the upper class in Scandinavia to own one or two slaves on your farm. In Iceland, it was significant for establishing the Scandinavian settlement there. But then really it's the slave trading, which was economically significant, particularly with the East. And then you've got ransoming, which is somewhere in between slavery and not. It's related. It's about taking people against their will, hoping for money, but instead of selling them into slavery, you're just giving them back to their communities. But that seems to be the most significant, I suppose, human trafficking related aspect of Viking raids. And then the slavery itself is very geographically based, how significant it was.
And so now, based on your research and your expertise and your experience, let's talk about the difficulty in researching a subject like this that you're focusing on. How difficult is it to research and study slavery in the Viking world?
The whole reason why I set out to write this dissertation was because I noticed that there wasn't a single book on it, really. It really was a process of synthesizing a lot of sources. There's plenty written on the individual regions. You've got the primary sources to work with, but there's nothing that actually gives you the book on Viking slavery, slavery in the Scandinavian world during the Viking Age, however you want to put it. And some of the difficulties really was just that, finding as many sources as possible and putting them together. So the stuff is out there, but you need some pretty good JSTOR credentials to get access to all of it. And I would say that really the sort of scholarly challenges are that we have so few texts written from a sort of neutral perspective. We have very few texts written from the perspective of the slaves themselves. We have a couple, like we have runestones, which former slaves claim to have erected. You've got this great example of a runestone erected by Toki Smithr, so Toki the Smith, in which he thanks his former owner for giving him freedom and gold. But it's also the kind of runestone that doesn't give us a lot of information on how unfree was Toki. Was Toki a thrall? Was Toki a bruti? We can't really know that. And the ambiguity of the terminology definitely creates a challenge, which is why it's great that there is a lot of scholarship thinking about the nuances of the terminology, thinking about the language. But then there is a challenge that there are so few sources that are directly from the Viking Age. Some older scholarship would refer to this poem, Rigstula, which is an account of Rig, which is another name for Heimdallr, going and sleeping with women from 3 different social groups. And so that poem, some of the earliest estimates would say that it's from 9th century or earlier. So it has been used as evidence for slavery in the Viking Age. However, the social structure that the poem comes to describe, with a clear sort of landed nobility below kings, that indicates that it can't be a Viking Age source. So you do have this trouble that some of the sources, particularly literary sources, are difficult to pin down. So there's very few stuff that's from a Scandinavian perspective in the Viking Age. The Viking Age sources tend to be from people who are the victims of the Scandinavian raiding. So it's difficult to say how much we can trust the word of, say, some Frankish cleric whose brother has perhaps been taken captive by the Vikings. Or, there is a a very interesting case. There's the Chronicon of Thietmar of Merseburg. A couple of Thietmar's uncles were taken captive by the Vikings. And so on the one hand, it's a great source because it's so close to the subject, but then you've got to consider all of the biases that Thietmar could be bringing to the table, particularly as then Thietmar isn't always so good with the details, as later in the Chronicon, he claims that Edmund Ironside and Thorkel the Tall died in the same battle, whereas the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that no, they didn't. They did not die at that battle. So there is always the question of reliability with medieval sources. And it's so hard to say how much has been lost. You've got stuff like the fragmentary Irish Annals, which mention a fantastic account of Scandinavian raiders who wound up in Africa, and after sort of like West Africa, fought a battle, took some soldiers captive, and brought them to Ireland. And then there's an account of these black slaves in Ireland during the Viking Age. And this is just in these fragmentary Irish annals, which are, they're fragmentary annals. They're missing bits and pieces. So there is, of course, the question of how much have we lost? That's why when researching this, my favorite part from a primary source perspective was looking at Eastern Europe and Central Asia, because the sources weren't from Scandinavians. They weren't from the victims directly. You had these Arabic and Byzantine sources which discuss the slave trading going on from the point of view of a third party, which adds some semblance of neutrality. But then you've got to consider, like in the example of Ibn Fadlan, him basically describing Scandinavians just raping their slaves regularly. And then you've got the contradicting account of Ibn Rusta, who says that the slaves were treated very well. And so it's very difficult to say about it's hard to say how did the Scandinavians treat their slaves, for example. That's something that we don't have much evidence on. But the primary sources, we have what we have, we work with them. Another difficulty was thinking about the biases of prior scholars. And one of the main issues was that Scandinavian slavery wasn't necessarily something that was thought about much prior to about 50 years ago, because you had this sort of mythologized idea of Viking Age Scandinavia being a sort of a proto-constitutional monarchy situation where you had free farmers who could stand up to the king, and things were, shared rules and laws were established at things, so forth. And this was in a lot of Scandinavian scholarship. Then when you look to England, you basically have scholarship which is claiming that the Scandinavians brought slavery to the British Isles, and that in this sort of idealized pre-1066 England, where this is a problem with nationalistic scholarship in general, where in the history of Anglo-Saxon England, you have this perception that, it was almost a democratic society. Like scholars have in the past tried to push this sort of conception, and that this was something that was ruined when William the Conqueror came. And so in that sort of mindset, of course, there wasn't slavery in Britain until the Vikings brought it. And so looking at some scholarship from the 60s, you will find accounts of yes, the only reason the Welsh started trading slaves was because there was a slave market at Bristol and one at Dublin. And so, of course, it was a good idea to get on with this. When then you consider the fact that slavery in England wasn't banned until 1102, if my memory serves me right. In Ireland, it would have been a couple decades later, and even then, specifically English slaves. So you really do end up having to consider the weight of prior scholarship and nationalist biases, national romantic biases, and you need to be ready to confront those and consider where those scholars are coming from.
You've talked about previous scholarship and how biased it was. And so my next question is, how has academia changed over time on the issue of slavery in the Viking world?
So, like I was saying, considering that a lot of the scholarship and interest in the Viking world stems from national romanticism in the modern Scandinavian countries. In the Scandinavian scholarship, you did have this. Initially, it was just ignored or considered not such a big thing. 50 years back, slavery entered the discussion, but then serious estimates of how important was it didn't start coming for a couple decades. One could argue, and so in Stefan Brink's The Viking World, a great book which has a good chapter on slavery in the Viking Age. I would recommend reading that as a sort of primer into the subject. It's mentioned that estimates for how many slaves there were in Viking Age Scandinavia at their highest have been, maybe 50% of the population were slaves. And so those estimates have definitely gone down in recent decades. So there might have been a bit of an overcorrection a couple decades back, considering that it was so under-discussed for a while. Really, then on the English and Irish, Welsh, Scottish side of the question, there's the fact that for so long, the Scandinavians were viewed as these brutal ravagers, pirates. And so the aspect of enslavement and slavery was probably also overemphasized in contrast with the Scandinavian scholarship. This is also contributed to by later sources. So, for example, looking at some of the already going to sort of Anglo-Norman period, you've got sources that claim that, King Knut the Great's wife was a slave trader taking English slaves to Norway. There isn't really historical evidence for that. And so it's really difficult with some of these things where you've got the weight of decades and centuries of particular ideas that need to be questioned. And so, when we consider, as I was saying, the question of, where does slavery in the British Isles originate? I think it's fair to say that most people no longer believe that it was the Scandinavians brought slavery. But there is certainly truth to the idea that the Scandinavians did increase slave trading when they settled in Dublin, because Dublin became an important part of the North Atlantic network of slave markets. And so when we go back to Melkorka, whom I mentioned earlier, so in the Laxdæla saga, Melkorka is sold in Denmark. So she was an Irish slave who found her way to Denmark. So clearly there was a network there. So we can't, and because Melkorka is also attested to in the more historical Landnama book, we can be she very well could have been a historical character. There's, I would say it's with one of the issues is that we have literary sources which are very close to historical sources, and it's hard to draw a clear line of where this saga is clearly to be ignored and where some bits can be considered. So the fact that Melkorka is also mentioned in multiple places, to me indicates that she was probably a real person. And with a lot of these early Irish people, based on linguistic research, it's definitely believable that they were actually in Iceland, because you have this, the way in which their names were written in these sources matches how they would have been pronounced in Old Irish at the time. And it would be one hell of a coincidence if a couple generations down, Old Norse writers would manage to accidentally recreate the way in which an Irish name would have sounded a couple centuries back. That is very unlikely. And so, there's clearly evidence for slaves in these Scandinavian societies, but because many of the sources are literary, there is always a tendency by some scholars to ignore these literary sources because they're not histories, they have clear political agendas, but in the case of Iceland, they should be studied very carefully because you will find real evidence of real history because they're oral traditions. They've been passed down through generations. There will be details which are accurate.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today at the Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages. Matthias von Hannen has guided us excellently into an obscure and fascinating subject that I very much enjoyed, and that is the issue of slavery in the Viking world, how we viewed it in the past, how we view it now. And honestly, this has been absolutely fantastic. And thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Check out the links in the video description below. It's going to take you to all of the awesome work that he is currently doing and that he plans to do in the future. And so definitely take advantage of all the awesome insights that he has to offer to help people like me and you better understand the subjects that we all love.